Our first reading comes from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. Abraham tested. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son, Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram, caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Our gospel reading comes from Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42. "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives the one who sent me. Anyone who receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who receives a righteous man because he is a righteous man will receive a righteous man's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because he is my disciple, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward."
When I was a student minister at Clayton Wesley, David was up the front, and I was amazed that, where are you, David? There. That he never used notes and would just stand there and talk. And surprise, surprise, I find myself doing the same thing. You never know what effect you have, do you? I don't know about you, but my first reaction to that first reading was, "Oh, yuck." And then the second one was, "Help." And yet it's a really important reading, which is why we're not skipping it. The idea of someone sacrificing their child is abhorrent to us, isn't it? The idea of someone sacrificing a lamb these days to a god as part of worship is often almost as abhorrent. It's not part of our life. It's not part of our culture. It's not what we do. And we value our children. Abraham also valued his son. Previously, he sent his other son by Hagar off, and he's left with just Isaac. And Isaac has grown up and has learnt about how Abraham and Sarah have left home and have followed this God. And they've been on quite a journey. But today we hear God wasn't sure. Really? God's not sure? God wanted to know how great Abraham's love was for him. And so he tests him. I find it's hard to come to a God who likes to send us tests as well. I've often wondered, what did Abraham and Isaac talk about on the way up? Did Isaac go, "Still not seeing a sheep, Dad? When is God going to provide? What's happening?" Did Abraham tell Sarah what's going on? Imagine being Sarah. You've longed for a child your whole life. You've waited until you're elderly and then you've moved. Not to a place that, cooks meals and does the cleaning and all the rest of that, but in a tent. You've moved into a strange land. And then after menopause, you were having a baby, and now hubby says, "Oh, by the way, God says we've got to kill Isaac." Did he let her know? We don't have answers for all these things, do we? And yet, they lived in such a different time. They've travelled around, they've gone through strange lands, they have seen all the different customs. They lived in such a different world, and yet perhaps not. The world was a fearful place, an unknown place. People couldn't explain why things happened. So if bad things happened, it either had to be your fault, and you'd done something to make the gods angry. And the way to make the gods stop being angry was to sacrifice something. And what they would have seen frequently was people offering up what was most precious: their children. And so if Abraham had told the neighbours, "God's told me I really don't want to do this, but I have to go and sacrifice Isaac," people would have all been scared and waiting. And when Abraham came back down from the mountain with Isaac, there would have been a temptation to chase him back up there, because you haven't done what God said you had to do, and now we're all going to be punished. Now that's a very different way of thinking, isn't it? Child sacrifice was happening. One of the explanations I've heard was that this is the story that set the Jewish people apart as people who did not do this practice any longer. This is the story that says God will provide, and we do not have to sacrifice our children in this way. It set them apart. It made them different from the neighbours, and it made their God someone who cared about them and their children. Does it sound a bit different now? I still struggle with it. I still don't like it. But then someone asked, well, how do we sacrifice children now? We don't sacrifice our children. We don't do that stuff, don't we? If I ask at the nursing home, what was your childhood like? They might have said in some ways they were sacrificed. How many of them were sent off to war? How many of them didn't come home? How many of them came home so traumatised, brutalised and changed? It's a different form of child sacrifice, isn't it? And we still do it today. What about the things that we wear, the food that we eat, the things that we like to have? Do we think about the kids in other countries who make them? All the work that goes into them? Whether people are being paid, are they working in safe places? We know, but it's too big, isn't it, to fully engage. But it's another form, often, of child sacrifice. Maybe not our children, maybe not us personally, but someone else's. How about closer to home? How many families do you see struggling where mums and dads and kids are so time poor they hardly see each other because they're working off to pay a huge house and all the gadgets, but they're not actually getting to connect to each other or see each other? Maybe they're not sacrificing a life, but maybe they're sacrificing the time, the nurture, the family building up that we need. Maybe that's a form of child sacrifice too. Or the other parents who are living their lives through the kids, making them do 15 activities a week. Do they want to do them? So maybe it's not as foreign as we first thought. This story is part of the beginning of the Jewish tradition of saying we don't sacrifice in this way. And of course there are parallels with Jesus later on, isn't there? With God not withholding his son. With God saying, okay, here's my beloved. And letting him live his life. Letting him live his life so fully. Loving people so much that it threatens everybody. It threatens the way people see, the way people feel, who they're meant to interact with, until they can't face this love and they have to kill it. And it's allowed to happen. We often say, why does God allow bad things happen to good people? God lets us make us up our own minds. God is, if we want to talk of as parent, that person who respects us enough to let us live our lives. Jesus did so in a way that led to death. And we've taken his resurrection and what happened after as a way that stopped animal sacrifice. So we've moved the next step along, haven't we? In the New Testament reading today, the Gospel reading, Jesus spoke about how we treat others. If you honour this person because they're a prophet, if you honour that person because they're righteous, if you give one of my disciples a drink of water, it's about not sacrificing, but honouring, respecting, offering hospitality, moving from sacrifice into recognising each and every person as God's beloved child. Whether they are two and obviously a child, whether they're the teenager who knows everything, whether they're the stressed out parent who doesn't have time to think straight, whether they're the active retiree who's helping in lots of different ways, or whether you're the person in a comfort chair in the nursing home who can't hold a conversation anymore, can't go to the toilet, can't walk, has to be fed. They're still that beloved child of God. I'm also partly here to talk about Rest Haven And I am now in a spot where I'm trying to provide pastoral care for 240 people across 2 sites. It's a big job. And they often say life has no point anymore. Life has no meaning anymore. Why am I still here? We often pray for death, and that's okay. And yet, this week I found myself telling 2 different gatherings that their time with us is valuable. Their time with us is important, and it has meaning, it has purpose, it has worth. As we honour one another in our interactions. They'd often like to sacrifice themselves so that their families don't have to be bothered coming in, so that they're not a burden. And yet God still knows that they are his precious children, her precious children. My question at the moment is, how do we find meaning for people who feel like meaning has gone? Meaning has ended. What might that look like? Sometimes it's easier than others. Some people are still able. That's easy. Some people still have the gift of friendship. And we can say, I know why you're here. You make this other person's life so much more meaningful. You give so much. And yet sometimes it's still not enough. God calls us to offer hospitality to one another and to everyone. One of the things I'm telling my folk at the moment is, your families are rushing. You actually have the gift of time. When you offer hospitality, you can say to your family member, sit down, put your feet up, take a load off. Have time, space, breathe. That's a gift, isn't it? To those of us who are too busy. I'm here to ask also if any of you would like to walk with some of our residents in trying to work out what that meaning might be, to receive some of their hospitality. God calls all of us. God walks with all of us. God values all of us. And at each and every stage of our lives, I'm firmly convinced we have something to offer. We might not always see it, we might not always know it, but we have something to offer. So if you're interested, I've got 240 residents who are willing to work out what it is they've still got to offer. But God is in this place too. We've taken a story that began with horror, talked about sacrifice, and turned around to hospitality. Let us give thanks for the God who does not demand that we give up our children, does not demand that we kill or maim, but who offers life and life in abundance, who asks that the only sacrifice that we make may be one of service and of love that may lead to new life, this and every day. Amen.